Churchill Downs, May 2nd, 2009. 150,000 people packed into the stands, the infield, every inch of standing room this track could offer. Almost none of them came to watch him. He wasn't on anyone's list of favorites. Not the analysts, not the racing press, not the people who study bloodlines and prep races for a living. They'd looked right at him and decided he didn't belong in this conversation. Then the race happened. He came from dead last. He split horses that weren't supposed to give him room. And when he hit the finish line, he wasn't just winning. He was pulling away, opening a gap so wide that the announcer, still narrating a battle for the lead among the favorites, hadn't even noticed he'd already won. The margin, 6 3/4 lengths, the largest winning margin at the Kentucky Derby in over 60 years. The crowd didn't roar. For a few seconds, it went almost silent. 150,000 people, and the loudest sound in the stadium was the sound of people checking their programs, trying to figure out what they'd just watched. This is the story of the horse nobody believed in, and the 2 minutes that made the entire sport go quiet. Start with the basics, and the basics were already working against him. He was a gelding, which, in a sport built on breeding and bloodlines and the value of what a champion horse can produce afterward, is close to a disqualification before the race even begins. Nobody invests real hope in a horse that can't become a stallion. There's no future payoff, no next generation of champions to point to. There's only the race in front of him, and nothing else. He'd been bought as a yearling for a price so modest it barely registered against what serious Derby contenders typically cost. This wasn't a horse bred and raised with a shot at the Triple Crown in mind. He was a long-term afterthought, the kind of horse nobody circles on a scouting report, who happened to keep winning smaller races until somebody had to admit he might belong in the conversation after all. And then there was geography. His career was built in New Mexico, far removed from the powerhouse East Coast circuits that produce the horses everyone actually watches. It's not just a matter of distance, it's a matter of respect. The horses that come out of the traditional pipelines get the benefit of the doubt before they've even stepped onto the track. The ones that come out of nowhere have to prove it twice, 3 times, and then prove it again just to be taken seriously. By the time he shipped into Churchill Downs that week, most of the experts had already made up their minds. He wasn't dismissed with hostility. He was dismissed with indifference, which is somehow worse. A trainer wearing a cowboy hat, a modest budget, a gelding from the Southwest. A nice story to mention in passing, not a contender to actually study. Picture the contrast. A small regional track built for a few thousand spectators on a good day, the kind of place where a big crowd is a few hundred people leaning on a rail, and then Churchill Downs on the first Saturday in May. The twin spires, the infield packed shoulder to shoulder, television cameras trained on the favorites, while his stall barely got a mention on the broadcast. Derby Day itself is its own kind of spectacle. It isn't just a horse race, it's the closest thing American sports has to a coronation. The pageantry, the crowds, the sheer scale of attention focused on a single afternoon, a stage built specifically to turn a handful of horses into legends before the gates even open. Every conversation that morning circled back to the same handful of names: the horses with the pedigree, the prep race resumes, the pipeline behind them, the connections everyone already recognized. He wasn't part of that conversation, not because anyone had studied him and found him lacking, but because almost nobody was studying him at all. He was background noise in a story that had already been written about someone else. His jockey had a plan that had nothing to do with matching the favorite's speed. It was patience. Save ground early. Stay tucked along the rail. Let the frontrunners spend their energy fighting each other for position, and wait for the one moment the race actually opened up. It's a strategy that requires total conviction, because for most of the race, it looks like doing nothing while the field pulls away and the moment slips further out of reach. And that's exactly what it looked like. As the horses rounded the far turn, cameras were locked on the leaders. The broadcast booth was building the story around the favorites, calling their moves, tracking their positioning. Nobody was watching the horse buried near the back of the pack, quietly closing the distance one stride at a time, patient in a way that looked, from the outside, almost like giving up. This is the part people still talk about. Coming off the turn, a gap opened along the rail. The kind of gap that exists for maybe 2 or 3 strides before it closes again for good. His jockey didn't hesitate. He aimed the horse directly through it, threading a path that had looked impossible just moments before. The kind of gap most riders would never even attempt. And then something happened that separates a good run from a legendary one. He didn't just get through, he kept accelerating. The leaders, who had spent themselves fighting for position on the front end, had nothing left to answer with. He hit the front, and instead of hanging on, instead of fading the way an overlooked horse is supposed to fade in the final furlong, he pulled away and kept pulling away. The margin at the wire was 6 3/4 lengths. To put that in context, in over 60 years of Kentucky Derbies, no horse had crossed the finish line with that much daylight behind him. This wasn't a photo finish. It wasn't a nail-biter decided by inches. It was a rout, delivered by the one horse nobody had bothered to build a story around. The reaction in the stands wasn't celebration. Not at first. It was stunned quiet. People weren't cheering. They were staring at the tote board, at their programs, trying to reconcile the name in the winner's circle with the horse they'd dismissed 20 minutes earlier. It took a long moment for the noise to catch up to what everyone had just seen, like the crowd needed permission to believe its own eyes. By every measure the sport usually trusts, this result shouldn't have happened. The pedigree pointed the wrong way. The price tag pointed the wrong way. The prep races pointed the wrong way. Everything experts use to separate contenders from pretenders said he belonged somewhere in the back half of the field, not standing in the winner's circle draped in flowers. 2 weeks later, he nearly did it again. In the next leg of the Triple Crown, he closed hard down the stretch and came up just short, finishing second behind a horse that would go on to be named Horse of the Year. It wasn't a win, but it silenced anyone still tempted to call the Derby result a fluke. This wasn't a horse who got fortunate once. This was a horse who had been underestimated from the very beginning, and kept proving it every time he ran. He never won another race after that Derby. But it didn't matter. What he did on that first Saturday in May had already secured his place in the sport's history, not just because of how unlikely it looked on paper, but because of how completely, how decisively he won. Upsets happen in horse racing all the time. Margins like his almost never do. Bring it full circle. A gelding, written off before he ever left the paddock, trained far from the sport's traditional power centers, on a fraction of the budget that builds a typical favorite. Dismissed by nearly everyone whose opinion usually shapes the conversation, treated as a footnote in a story about someone else. And on the one afternoon that mattered most, he didn't just beat the favorites, he buried them, and left the entire sport searching for an explanation that never quite arrived. Nobody in that stadium believed he could win. By the time he crossed the wire, none of them could believe what they'd just watched him do. Years later, people still bring up that race, the way you'd describe something you witnessed, rather than something you read about. Not because the story needed embellishing, but because the truth of it was already strange enough. A horse built out of every disadvantage the sport recognizes, standing at the finish line, further ahead than anyone had stood in 6 decades. There was no explanation that fully accounted for it. There still isn't. And maybe that's exactly why it's remembered. Not despite the fact that it made no sense, but because of it. If you want more stories like this one, the long shots, the horses nobody saw coming, and what it actually takes to bring a horse from nowhere to the winner's circle, like, and check the link below for the new Horse Owner's Handbook.